Okay. So thank you for inviting us. I'm happy and excited to talk about what's going on at LADWP with respect to how we're addressing climate change. There's been a lot going on in the city as a whole, and of course at LADWP when it comes to clean energy and meeting our water supply challenges in the face of climate change. So, LA has been a leader in climate change policy and in actions towards clean energy and towards reducing our greenhouse gas emissions. We were the first municipal utility to reach a 20% renewable energy target. And then we've been the #1 solar city in the US for 3 years straight. And we've reduced our greenhouse gas emissions by more than half from our 1990 levels, ahead of the state's 2030 target. And by 2030, we expect to exceed 80% reduction in greenhouse gas emissions. And we also recognize that it's not just about climate change, but and the greenhouse gases, but also about pollution, air pollution that still affects our communities. Los Angeles, still has the distinction of being the city with the most air pollution in the U.S. So we're trying to do our part to clean up our communities. And so we launched something about a year ago and just made some awards under something we call the Community Emission Reduction Grant Program, using funds that we have sort of gained by our investments in reducing greenhouse gas emissions and in supporting electrification to help support projects in pollution reducing projects in communities surrounding our power plants. So I know this morning there was a session fully devoted to the LA100 study, but kind of to give some context, Los Angeles has joined many other cities and states, and now the U.S. in striving for a net zero carbon goal by 2050, and for LADWP, we're also looking at a city goal of 100% carbon-free energy by 2035. And so in the LA100 study, looking at all of the different scenarios, one of the scenarios that was analyzed was whether it was feasible to achieve this carbon-free energy goal by 2035. And the LA100 study found that was possible. So it is now reflected in the announcement the mayor made in the state of the city that LADWP would get to 100% carbon-free energy by 2035. And just about 3 weeks ago, the city council passed a motion to get us to that goal. And in talking about, in the LA100 study, next slide, really kind of lays out the framework. Again, I know there was a panel this morning about that, but really looked at the pathways to get to 100% renewable and 100% carbon-free energy, along with and looking at other issues, including job creation, environmental benefits overall, and equity implications, of course, the cost and rate impacts. And so kind of what follows on to LA100 is really, how do we turn that actually, this planning document, into an actual plan that people can understand what the projects that are necessary to achieve these goals and the sequence, and identifying those projects in the sequence. So we sort of broken it up a little bit into parts, looking at the LA100 next step. So really looking at what do we need to do over the next 10 years. We just kicked off the stakeholder advisory group around the strategic long-term resource plan, which is a 25-year plan. And that again looks not only at the investments, but also everything else that it takes to support that goal. And then importantly, because we heard it from people during the LA100 study process itself, and of course from policymakers and the community here in Los Angeles, that issues around equity, around energy justice are incredibly important. And that's not just about pollution, but also impacts on communities, cost, and a number of other things that are becoming incredibly important, that are important and will be even more important as we make this transition to 100% carbon-free future. So the last thing that I wanted to just mention is around electrification, and there's a lot of dimensions to why electrification is so important as a strategy, and a strategy that we will see across the city. As I said, Los Angeles still has the worst air pollution in the nation, and the primary driver of smog and soot that are harmful to people's health is coming from the transportation sector. And as we clean up the grid, as the grid gets to 100% clean energy, electrifying the transportation sector, it really is kind of a win-win all the way around when it comes to the environmental benefits. Reducing air pollution and really helping our communities be healthier. It also turns out that the LA100 study also pointed out that electrification will help reduce vulnerability to climate change and result in improved health outcomes from these reductions in conventional air pollutants, and also really help to address some of the financial issues around the LA100. So more electricity sales makes the whole thing work. So we are really moving forward around helping to support electric vehicle charging infrastructure, also looking at opportunities to electrify buildings, also for the tremendous air pollution and greenhouse gas reduction benefits associated with electrification of our buildings. And so we're currently developing an electric vehicle master plan that will kind of line out how the city will address transportation electrification as a part of the overall strategy to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. So I think that's less than 10 minutes, Jack. So
you have 48 seconds left.
Okay, I will not filibuster for 48 seconds. Back up.
David, I think you're next, aren't you? You're muted, David.
Yeah, thank you. Yes, I'm happy to go next, and well, let me first start by congratulating everybody involved in organizing today's event, this Congress of Neighborhoods, the biggest annual event for the neighborhood councils. And thank you, Jack, for moderating. And Nancy, it's always a pleasure to be on a panel with you. Fred, looking forward to your remarks. And Johan, it's good to meet you. So I'm going to take hopefully not more than 10 minutes, maybe a minute more, Jack, with your indulgence. What I want to say is this: look, all of the actions that you're going to hear from your presentations in this segment will cost money, right? A lot of money, tens of billions of dollars. And of course, as citizens of LA, we're entitled to ask what the costs are going to be, why they're necessary, how the funds are going to be raised, and how they're going to be spent. Those are all legitimate questions. After all, people of LA are being asked to support the LA100 study, which, as you just heard from Nancy is LA's goal of reliable 100% electricity by 2035, only 14 years from now. And Operation Next, about which you will hear a little later on today, has the goal of recycling 100% of available wastewater from the Hyperion treatment plant also by 2035, again, with only 14 years from now. So first, let me just say that, and I'm glad that there is no debate any longer about the existence of climate change, right? And the most recent IPCC report, the UN Secretary General described climate change as a code red for humanity. The National Climate Assessment Report that came out right here in the United States in 2018 shows that the evidence of climate change is clear, it's irrefutable. Much damage is already embedded in the climate system. And right here at home, we're seeing evidence of it everywhere. Raging wildfires, unprecedented drought, extreme heat storms, worsening air quality, changes in precipitation patterns, sea level rise, with all of the attendant public health impacts. So it's clear that we have to do things both to protect ourselves, what people refer to as resilience or adaptation, and to do our part to stem the release of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere, what people refer to as mitigation. Now, to me, Operation Next, about which you will hear, as well as a slew of other measures on the water side, more conservation, cleaning our aquifers, capturing more of our rainfall when we do get it. These fall under the category of protecting ourselves from climate change. In this city, we're still heavily dependent on imported water that's neither cheap nor reliable at this point. You've heard about all of the water cuts by the State Water Resources Control Board, by the Bureau of Reclamation, historic from the Colorado River. So we must attain a degree of self-sufficiency in this city. And the cessation of the discharge of treated wastewater to the ocean is a great step in that direction. Now, how that is going to be achieved, the Hyperion treatment plant will have to be upgraded, and whether that water is going to be pumped to the central, west, or San Fernando basins to replenish the aquifer, how much will be pumped then to the filtration plant up in Sylmar. All of this needs to be decided by LADWP and decided quickly, but it is a step that is necessary to be taken. LA100, to me, is a bit of both. It's both about protecting ourselves from the pollution of fossil fuels, but it is also about doing our part to cut our greenhouse gas emissions. Now, some people will say, and this is true, that California's emissions don't contribute substantially to the global output of greenhouse gases. A recent study by UC Davis found that California is responsible for 1% of greenhouse gas emissions. Yeah, to me, that's still significant, but some people will argue that it isn't. And by the way, that 1%, 80% of that is fossil fuels, 41% transportation, 23% from industrial uses, 16% from the production of energy from power, which is what we're talking about today. But those voices overlook the co-pollutants that foul our air from fossil plants, which that Nancy so adroitly referred to earlier on. And by addressing the reduction of greenhouse gas emissions, we can also significantly improve local air quality, reduce hospitalizations, death from respiratory illnesses. We can do all of that. We can also reap enormous economic benefits by going down the road of this transformation. We can create thousands of local, good-paying jobs. However, having said all of this, we must also ensure reliability. We can't have the situation that bedeviled the CAISO last summer with rolling blackouts. We have to ensure success. This is not an experiment that we can afford to fail at. And we have to take care of the folks whose jobs may be jeopardized in the wake of progress. We also have to ensure that racial, social, environmental justice aspirations, standards are embedded in our programs, and that the financial burdens of this transformation don't fall on those least able to pay for it. But cost, there will be. But before that, I think we also need to take a look at the cost of not acting, right? So according to the insurance industry, the US had a record 27 separate billion-dollar weather disasters in 2020. Together, these events killed 262 people and cost over $95 billion. In 2021, just up to July, there have been 8 climate disaster events with losses exceeding $1 billion each. Overall, those events resulted in the deaths of 331 people. By some estimates, since 1980, the cost of climate weather disasters is around 1.9 trillion. So the climate crisis, we're paying for it already. It's costing us already. And that economic hemorrhaging will continue unless we act. Now, there's a lot of good news to celebrate, right? The city is already spending about $1 million on LA's public transportation network in recognition of the fact that transportation accounts for most of the greenhouse gas emissions from the city. We have policies such as the Cool Roofs policy, the Cool Streets programs, the Shade Trees programs. We have many nonprofit organizations. I'm so proud to serve with some of them, like the Los Angeles Business Council, the Los Angeles Clean Tech Incubator, Climate Resolve, LANE, the UCLA Luskin Center, the California Environmental Voters, all are at the table trying to address the means by which we successfully manage this transition to a clean economy. It would also be remiss of me not to commend the women and men of the Regional Water Quality Control Board, where I serve as a board member, for all of their fantastic work in taking care of the water resources in our region. But the biggest news of the day is, of course, Governor Newsom's bombshell announcement of a $15 billion package to tackle wildfires and drought, support climate resilience, especially in disadvantaged communities, and promote sustainable agriculture. And how that breaks down is $5.2 billion for water and drought, $3.7 billion for climate resilience, $1.1 billion for smart agriculture, and $3.9 billion for zero emission vehicles. And I understand that that money is already extant. And it'll, over the next 3 years, there will have to be, I think, a lot of attention paid to how these programs are going to be implemented. But it's great news and shows that there is money to be had. A final word, Jack, I promise, is just wanted to mention the private sector, right? We're not going to accomplish our goals without the involvement of the private sector. People who know me know that I'm a committed environmentalist. I believe that in California, we have a fragile environment which must be protected, but we also have to figure out a way to make it, I don't want to say easier, and I don't want to say simpler, but clearer for the private sector to know how to play its part as we go forward and embrace this bright new future for California. So I hope that's about 10 minutes, Jack. I'll stop there.
It was 9 minutes and 59 seconds, David.
Wow. All right.
Fred, you're on board now.
Let's see, how do I move ahead on this? There we go. The Office of Public Accountability Ratepayer Advocate did a review of the NREL study, and this discussion speaks to some of the results of our review. But I'd like to focus, since I only have 10 minutes, first on, as Nancy noted, showing the progress to date that DWP has made. And these power sector estimates shown here include indirect contributions to greenhouse gases as well as direct combustion. So they're a little bit different than the DWP reported numbers. I think what's important here is right now we're a little short of 13 million metric tons a year. And once we get the Intermountain Power Project out of our mix, we drop down, no matter what our scenario is, no matter what pathway in the LA100, to the 1 to 4 million metric ton range. So the big step is making sure we accomplish that on a timely basis. And then it turns out, and as I discussed this morning, and I won't repeat in detail, the big greenhouse gas savings, once we get past coal, really need to come from, or can come from, transportation and possibly building electrification. The one thing the LA100 study didn't do is it didn't do a cost benefit of the costs of building electrification and vehicle electrification. I think in some ways, electric vehicles in many vehicle classes are close to economic now. So I think the cost won't be a burden there, but in building electrification, that's still an issue. If we look at the costs of achieving these goals, and this has all the 9 pathways and more. It has a reference case for a 10th case on here, and it looks at the costs cumulative by scenario by year. And the costs are fairly closely grouped through 2030. We have 16 billion estimate in total costs for 2030, plus or minus a little short of 3 billion. If we go out to 2045, the costs spread out more, and it's 67 billion plus or minus 20 billion. Makes that 15 billion of the states look small, but that's just the plus or minus. Looking at these costs, we wanted to understand better when commitments had to be made to these costs, because there's a mixture of cost types here. To find out when we're committing, how much are we committing, what are we locked in for. So we looked at operating costs and capital costs. The capital costs are largely DWP related capital costs, and it's about 20% DWP capital expenditure, and the rest of the expenditures are operating expenses. If we look at the operating expenses, about 80% of the operating expenses is paying for PPA or power purchase agreements for renewable resources. So in a way, that's a lot like a lease payment for something you've already committed to. So if you look down in this corner, that shows the share of PPA expenses as a share of total. So what's happening is in the next 5 to 10 years, we're making a huge commitment via PPA expenses to for power purchases. If these power purchases are treated as forward contracts, which is an important component of bankruptcy law, we're locked into those and there's no escape. But the bankers are not always sure that's a good idea. So there's been some clever ways to try to escape the forward contract definition under bankruptcy law. But the key point here is a lot of our expenses build in the 30s, but some of the PPA expenses build earlier. The chart on the capital expenses here, these are broken down by transmission expenses and hydrogen generation and other components. Transmission is a big component. And excuse me, I'm colorblind, so I could screw these up. So hydrogen and combustion turbines are along the bottom. So those capital expenses unfold more slowly. What's the end result? This is all the different LA100 scenarios plus the reference case. The highest case is the reference case that is based on, but not entirely the same as, the Strategic Long-Term Resource Plan in 2017. And this is the low load scenario here. So you see that if we don't have the growth of electrification in transportation and in buildings, we're likely to have higher costs. So this is back to Nancy's statement that electrification and success in electrification is important for managing costs. And while in the long run, we hope this won't exceed 2.5% general inflation, in the short term, we have costs that will exceed. And the highest case is the old strategic long-term resource plan from 2017, coupled with low loads. So that's that is the highest scenario through 2030. I've learned by doing these kinds of plans for most of my career, you don't want to get cocky about your forecasts. These are load projections done by DWP over the last about 15 years. And you see how perpetually people are forecasting growth in energy sales. Well, that line along the bottom there are actual sales. Similarly, these are the peak loads, which also have been projected upward, but the actual is along the bottom there. And the biggest risk, or the uncertainty in these load forecasts, looking at the SB100, you can't quite see it because, well, you may be able to see it on your screen. On my screen, I can't quite see the endpoint, but the uncertainty in the impact of the growth of load is as big as the difference between the different pathways for the strategies. Second thing is we're not very good at forecasting the costs of technologies. This was in
1 minute.
2009 and 2019. We got some things went way down further and other things went up a lot faster. This also applies to projections of EV sales. The LA100 had these two scenarios at 11 and 8% per year, but there are others that forecast faster. If it goes faster, DWP will be pressed to accomplish it. In summary, I'd like to make sure we focus on GHG reduction, not just renewables. Two, we got to do work on the costs and benefits. Three, focus on the near term with what we can achieve with certainty and keep our options, the no regret investments, as the uncertainties develop. And redevelop our plan for procuring renewables over this period and try to sort out which ones are beneficial in the short term and what do we want to wait for as costs may go lower. These are the conclusions by Brattle. That's my conclusion.
Oh, okay. Well, Fred, you made it. 10 minutes. It's a record. Johan, I think it's your turn to talk about Operation Next. Or as I say, Johan, you're next.
Thank you. That's a great intro. Let me share my screen before I get started. Let me know if you're able to see my screen.
We're starting there.
Yes.
Yes.
Those are perfect. All right. So in theory, it should be maximized. Let me know if it's maximized.
Yep.
All right, so I'll get started then. Good afternoon. My name is Johan Torledo. I am the manager for Operation Next. And on the subject of climate change, drought, and strategies to mitigate the impacts in Los Angeles, in the few minutes that I have, my goal will be to introduce you to Operation Next, a program of scale of DWP only comparable to the Mulholland Aqueduct built in 1913. During this presentation, I will introduce you to Operation Next. I'll provide a briefly update regarding the schedule and the budget, and I'll talk a little bit about outreach and environmental efforts that are taking place. Okay, so first of all, what is Operation Next? To further enhance LA's resiliency, reliability, and sustainability, LADWP has embarked on a visionary and transformational initiative. The initiative, dubbed Operation Next, will help achieve LA's local water supply goal of recycling 100% of available purified wastewater from the Hyperion Water Reclamation Plant, which is owned by LA100, creating a new sustainable water source for Los Angeles while leveraging local groundwater basin storage. The Operation Next program will convey a new local water supply using water source for Los Angeles. The existing Hyperion plant will be retrofitted with a series of new recycled water treatment facilities under the Hyperion 2035 program. The advanced treated recycled water from Hyperion will be conveyed into what we refer as buckets via Operation Next. This program has potential to allow LA to develop resilient infrastructure with sustainability and equity. Operation Next will rise Los Angeles to a sustainable society, not only by improving the water portfolio, but also by improving LA's economic through creation of an estimated 2,800 jobs throughout Operation Next. This slide just shows the roadmap for Operation Next and the strategy, and all the strategies, as you see here, they're geared towards three main goals: sustainability, reliability, resiliency. Short-term goals that we have, they include developing budget and schedule baselines, environmental outreach, and community outreach. Midterms, they outline institutional agreements, environmental management, and project initiations. And then lastly, the long-term efforts that we have and goals, they pertain to the actual delivery of the projects, outreach, and budget and schedule management. So you see there are some constants throughout the roadmap, things that we want to focus on to make sure that we provide the right program management structure to Operation Next. So given the size of Operation Next, LADWP is going to need to strategize how to manage the supply from Hyperion. A holistic strategy needs to be developed to store water throughout the city to properly manage the flow. The strategy will be to distribute the future supply from Hyperion, located along the coast, through different basins in Los Angeles, all the way up to the filtration plant in the north of the city. Speaking in water terms, 4 buckets will be required to manage the water, with 1 additional bucket to improve regional resilience. So here we have the first bucket, which we refer to as the West Coast Basin. This will allow us to replenish and participate in providing supply into the harbor system to the south, and also to participate with WRD. The next bucket that we have, it pertains to sending water from Operation Next into the Central Basin. Here we'll have options and ability to inject water and extract water to provide a supply to the Central Basin system. The third bucket that we have, it pertains to the San Fernando Basin. Here we have potential to store more water. Here again, we'll be able to replenish the groundwater through injection, and extraction will be taking place to take some of the water and provide a service to the supply in the north. Lastly, we have implementation of DPR applications to the filtration plant. This is the true success of Operation Next. Roughly 80% of the flow that comes out of Hyperion will be able to be treated through DPR, direct potable reuse, so that it could be enhanced into the filtration plant, either through the high-speed channel or the Los Angeles Reservoir. Lastly, I mentioned the last bucket that improves regional resiliency, and that actually pertains to how DWP is able to convey some of that water into MWD's backbone system to, again, enhance the resiliency for the region. All right, so this proposed program includes pipelines, groundwater injection, extraction wells, pump stations, groundwater treatment facilities, storage, and distribution system upgrades. Initial findings estimate 32 years to execute the program. Preliminary analysis has identified roughly about 30 projects under the overall program. As was mentioned, bold ideas to mitigate climate change will require bold investments. The program cost is estimated between $8.2 to $16.2 billion, depending on the strategy to manage new water supply, with the higher range cost allowing the execution of the 5 buckets of water that I mentioned. This estimate is a class 5 order magnitude estimate, and the class 5 estimate uses a concept screening level information. We are aware of the potential impacts to ratepayers and are actively developing various scenarios that look at leveling the production on cash flows. Obviously, the faster that we implement this program, the more money that is going to be spent. So we want to be able to manage the expenditure in a way that is going to accurately manage the supply from Hyperion. Regarding outreach, as we see here, we know and understand the importance of stakeholder engagement and outreach. Our team has provided various presentations to different council districts and different stakeholders. Roughly about 150 presentations have been made, and we have created a project website, which is here, so that the general public can be aware of what's taking place for Operation Next. Regarding environmental, our environmental efforts are focusing on the development of a programmatic environmental impact report. The first step was the release of the NOP, which was released on March 15th. The public comment review was held from March 15th through May 14th. And right now our efforts regarding environmental are geared towards developing the PEIR, the Programmatic Environmental Impact Report. We're currently working with LA100 in partnership to complete this document, and we expect this document to be adopted and completed by spring of 2023. I want to thank you for your time, and if there are any questions, I am able to provide any answers. Thank you.
Well, Johan, you had 3 minutes left. You're hired.
Thanks. A lot of information. I try to condense it as much as possible, and I hope I did not go too fast. But like I said, I have time to answer any questions, but if you want to follow up with me, my number's here. My contact information is on the web page as well, should you have any additional needs for presentations or any just general inquiries that you may have.
Yeah. Hey, David, there's a question for you in chat, basically saying, what can the neighborhood councils do?
Oh, I think a lot. You know, I'm reminded, Jack, as you'll recall, of the days when I was at LADWP, and we developed the neighborhood councils, LADWP MOU, and there was so much more involvement between the neighborhood councils and LADWP following the execution of that MOU. So I think you know the kind of level of you know vigilance and scrutiny and involvement that we're actually seeing here today is what's necessary. And I know that LADWP and LA100 on with respect to Hyperion are going to want to reach out to the neighborhood councils and have a very detailed discussion every step of the way, because the neighborhood councils are also, in a way, emissaries to the rest of the city. So I think just that ongoing dialogue and involvement is tremendously important.
Johan, I have a question for you. A couple of months ago, the Metropolitan Water District made a presentation about developing their recycled operation down in, I think it was Carson, if I'm not mistaken, Fred. And you know, how are you guys going to work with? How's DWP going to work with Met, especially given that you know Adele is there now, and he's one of us. So I just you know, and they're going to spend a lot of money. So how are you guys going to work together, if at all?
The first step that we've done is we actually looked at the RFP that they had for that specific project. We basically broke it up into comparable work packages to make sure that we were following similar approach, that we were actually making similar analysis, also to compare the cost of the program to make sure that we were within range. Something that we're doing is stakeholder management and engagement. So we have actually started coordinating and meeting proactively with MWD. We've had our first 2 workshops with them to basically talk about the possibilities of water exchanges, not only through that pipeline, the 5th bucket that I mentioned in my presentation, that goes from the central basin into their backbone system. There's also possibilities to make a connection from the filtration plant to their Jensen plant. So yes, to answer your question, we'll be having semi-annual meetings with them to to make sure that our efforts are moving in the right direction, that any kind of decision that is made is going to be complementary with one another, so we could continue to provide a regional resiliency.
Let me see if there's any questions. Are there any questions in chat? Or has anybody raised their hand? I don't see anybody having raised their hand. I get
Dr. Pickle and Lara.
I have a question that has to do with electrification of buildings. I live in a building that was built in 1922, and we recently found out that our pipes for natural gas were deteriorated enough that we needed to replace them. And I wanted to go to electric for stoves and heating units in our apartment building. And the biggest challenge I ran into was that working with LADWP to upgrade electricity coming into the building and getting the permits was estimated from a minimum of 3 months to a maximum of about 18 months. And we couldn't operate this property with people not having access to cooking and heat for that long a period of time. And I feel like we are not the only building that is in this situation. And I want to know that LADWP is aware that this is an issue that needs to be addressed.
who's going to take that one? Nancy?
Yeah, I can take that. Thank you. And thanks for raising that. Yeah, one of the things that we are that's necessary for us to do to support this electrification is really to look at the grid itself. And there are, as you pointed out, a lot of older buildings in Los Angeles. There's a lot of older parts of our grid that we need to take a look at and ensure that there's plenty. We don't really have a concern that there's not enough electricity overall, but getting it to the right places and getting it into buildings is going to be a challenge for certain places in certain parts of the city. So that's something that we are taking a look at, and necessarily help your immediate situation. And I'm happy to follow up with you and see if there's something that we could help you out with.
Nancy, this is Jack. One of the things that I've seen, I tend to receive a few calls about DWP from time to time.
I'll bet you do.
But one of the things is, it's not only the time frame that DWP has, but also that you're somewhat held up by building and safety. When you have a project, building and safety has to put their nose into it. You got to put your nose into it, and somehow a lot gets lost in translation. I guess I'd say, is there any way that DWP and building and safety can work to expedite whatever is the permits and the certificate of occupancies or whatever you need to get these things moving along faster for Lara's case?
Yeah, no, it's a good question, and I think we may be a little further along on on things like installing electric vehicle chargers, because there's issues there as well, and making sure that the city is all working together. But it will take a lot of coordination to do this in a timely way, and that's something I think the city has to be willing to take on it as a whole, and especially. Our building codes are changing, they're being updated. And so new buildings have to have a certain amount of parking spaces that are sort of EV ready, and a number of other things. But that's that also is a little bit of work in progress. And, I think some of the, and I know you get the phone calls, but we get a lot of requests for upgraded service and new service from the individual household level all the way up to these, large real estate developments that are coming in different parts of the city. And that is, and the electrification request to interconnect electric vehicle chargers. So that is something that we are very focused on. Thanks.
Fred, why don't you go ahead? You had your hand up.
I think I've accomplished that finally. I think there's a lesson from Mulholland as we go forward. We have potential mega projects, transmission, storage, and on the water side, there's Operation Next. The lesson from Mulholland is when he put in the LA aqueduct, he did it LADWP did it on its own and bet the city in the process. We won that bet, but the second time he did it, it was MWD and it involved multiple parties. And one of the components as we're addressing these major projects, mega projects, is reducing the risk of some of these projects by doing joint projects. And that it's challenging to negotiate those, but I think given the timeline for either power transmission or projects like Operation Next, I think it's important to consider that. And certainly MWD is an obvious partner in this process.
Okay, David, you're next. You have 2 minutes.
Thank you. Well, I have a quick comment, and I had a question for Johan. But first, in terms of city departments working together, Nancy will remember when she was deputy mayor, she would regularly convene a meeting of various departments: planning, DWP, LA100, Bureau of Engineering, get all of the GMs in one room and have a coordination between them about how they were going forward. And it was, I think, very successful at that time to make sure that the departments were not actually working at cross purposes or weren't aligned in one direction. And maybe that's one thing to think about. The second thing that I think folks need to know is that in order for LA100 to be successful, DWP is going to have to hire a lot of people. And the current hiring procedures through the city's civil service system are standing in the way of that. And some real focus has to be brought to how LADWP can hire the people that it needs in order to satisfy these momentous transformational city objectives that are being asked of it. So quick comment and then a question for Johan. Johan, you mentioned very quickly DPR, direct potable reuse. So as you're going out and as you're talking to people in the city about both indirect potable use, but now direct potable reuse, and the fact that we have the technology now to do this safely, how are you talking about that? And what kind of reaction are you getting in terms of talking about direct reuse?
One of the first steps that we're taking, we actually have a group in DWP called Water Recycling Policy, and a lot of the outreach for direct potable reuse has been done through that group. We're trying to make sure that the general public understands, as you mentioned, that there are technologies that allows that type of treatment for water. That solution has been implemented successfully in other countries, such as Singapore. We're also right now currently coordinating with DDW. As you may or may not know, right now the direct potable reuse, the DPR regulations are in draft form. So what DWP is doing, partnering with LA100 and other agencies that are trying to execute a similar strategy, is that we're providing feedback on those regulations, not only to provide some of the concerns that we have, but also to request flexibility, because one solution that fits every agency is not going to be viable. We need to have flexibility and creativity so that we are able to implement solutions that are going to work well with the water quality constraints that we have, but also with, as you mentioned, budget and resource limitations, right? As we move forward through Operation Next, and then I talk about the range of costs and different strategies. Our first strategy is basically to deal with IPR, which is more or less the water that is going to be coming up Hyperion. Most of that water is going to be used throughout the basins. Again, as I mentioned, injection, extraction, spreading through the San Fernando basins. But as I mentioned, the true value of Operation X is basically sending the water to the filtration plant, and at that point, actually doing the treatment of DPR. It doesn't make sense for us to do a treatment for DPR right at the filtration plant because most of the water is going to be going into the groundwater basin or being spread. So we don't want to pay for a high cost of water at that point. We want to be able to manage the program well, and that's when we talk about strategy. How do we manage it? So just to circle back to your original question, there is a continuous need to educate the general public. First of all, that DPR is a viable, sustainable solution. Second of all, that basically we're on a drought, right? This is the first time in about, if I recall correctly, 1,200 years that we are experiencing a lot of concerns in regards to how we get the water. Right now, our water, about 89% of the supply comes from imported resources. We only have about 11% from local water portfolio. So we need to definitely increase that, not only to be more sustainable when we talk about climate change, but also resiliency, right? If we're able to develop our local groundwater resources, or even just get the water from Hyperion to DPR, then in the event that there was a large earthquake, we're able to be self-sustainable and not depend on the Colorado River, the State Water Project, or the aqueduct to be able to continue moving forward. As you mentioned, if there's some sort of catastrophic event, water supplies that are cut, then it's basically losses to the economy. So again, I believe it's an amazing initiative, and I hope that everyone wants to support it. And as you mentioned, resources are going to be critical. So
Johan, I think we're getting close to the end.
All right.
Julian, are we done? I guess, thank you everybody for coming, and David, nice seeing you again. Fred, Nancy, Johan, nice meeting you. And Laura, I'm sorry we didn't get to your question, but you're gonna have to learn to unmute yourself.
Yes, sorry about that. I lost the Zoom, I had to re-log in. It's okay. I'll send Nancy an email.
Okie dokie. Well, thank you, everybody. It's been a very, very good day, and thank you, Julian, and for the people at Dunn who made our life technically a lot easier.